Hey guys, I'm Jeremy. I'm here in Buffalo, New York at Delaware Park. Here I'm going to tell you a pretty tragic but interesting story of William McKinley, who was assassinated here at the PanAmerican Exposition in 1901. It was a pretty interesting time in America because this is when America really became like an empire. It was kind of the beginning. Now, of course, they had their westward expansion, but up until that point, they never had any colonies. The United States was in a huge depression at that time, and so they were hoping to get out of that. So the election during that time was about the economy and also about silver and gold. So anyway, I'll go into more about McKinley's life in that election and his assassination, and I'll visit some of the areas like where he was shot and some other memorials. He was here at the PanAmerican Exposition, which was a huge display of like all of the achievements and arts and science and things, like a big fair basically. And I'm actually in Delaware Park now, and the southern part of the exposition included part of this park I'm walking through now. So McKinley was born in Pennsylvania in 1843, but moved to Niles, Ohio, and later Poland, Ohio for better schools. Both his parents were in iron making, and so I assume they were like lower middle class. In 1861, the Civil War began, and he joins the other Ohio volunteers to join the war under the Union. He was a great soldier, and he took to being in the Army very well, and he served in many battles. And in Antietam, which was considered one of the most bloody battles of the entire Civil War, he actually rode a horse with a cart of rations to soldiers who needed them in front of like really heavy fire. So he rose up the ranks quickly, and he ended up leaving the Civil War as a major. After the war, he goes to law school and becomes a lawyer and lives in Canton, Ohio, and then he begins getting into politics. He first helps his friend Ruther B. Hayes get elected, and then he begins his own career into politics. In 1871, he gets married to Ida Saxton, and they have 2 daughters. But unfortunately, they both died really young. One was only a year or 2 old, and the other one was about 4, and they both died within like a few days of each other. So his wife was absolutely devastated and never physically or mentally got over that for the rest of her life. And then they had no more children after that, so really tragic. So he works his way up through the ranks of Republican politics. He was in the House of Representatives in Ohio, and then he ended up becoming the governor, and then of course later the President of the United States. So in the 1896 election, he goes against William Jennings Bryan, and there were a couple of issues in this election. In 1893, just 3 years earlier, there was a huge depression that they were still going through. And the issue about silver was a big thing because at that time they had pegged silver and gold to the dollar. It was like 16-to-1 ratio, gold to silver. And the free silver they would purchase would be at inflated prices, so that would help miners in like Colorado and other places, for instance. And so the Democrats were running on free silvers, like for the working man, and McKinley was more for just using the gold standards, which is what they switched to a year or 2 after that. So William Jennings Bryan was actually the youngest person to ever be elected in any political party to run for the presidency. He was only 36, and he was a great orator. And so he went around the country on a whistle-stop tour, just took a train to all the different cities to make all these great speeches. And so McKinley's like already almost in his mid-50s, and he's like, I'm not going to go all over the country and try to compete with this guy. So I'm actually going to do all of my campaigning right from my front porch in Canton, Ohio. So about 750,000 people around that year had come out and actually stopped at his house. And he'd do different speeches and also was interviewed by someone about his positions on different things. And in general, that was his style. He would be very personable and go up to people in public before there was a Secret Service. Even in both parties, they did respect him because he was such a good guy, really popular. And he didn't even have any enemies, which was quite rare in politics, obviously. And so McKinley ends up getting 60% of the vote, and Bryan got 40, obviously. And he begins his presidency, trying to get out of this depression. And one of the first big events that happened was the issue of Cuban independence from Spain, So just to give you a little bit of a background here, I know America's been more of an imperialist in more recent decades, but at that time, they were trying to be like the little guy. They had obviously fought colonialism because they had fought the British to get independence. And so they really looked down at the European powers and their colonies in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and everywhere else. So the United States was trying to be like the better country and not do that kind of thing. Now, of course, they did expand across North America and had taken land away from the natives, but that wasn't looked at as the same thing at that time. So by this time, Spain had already lost most of its colonies in Latin America. And so there was this uprising in Cuba, and Americans were very sympathetic, and the public wanted to get involved. McKinley's position going into office was that he didn't want to get involved in any international disputes. He was an isolationist. He wanted tariffs on goods and things like this. And he tried to negotiate for a few months and tried to have Spain give some concessions and things to the rebels in Cuba. But it didn't work out, and there were still these big riots in Havana. And so he sent the USS battleship Maine down near Havana, and it was there for about 3 weeks, and it exploded. About 262 sailors died. And so, of course, everyone in America was super pissed. So I think what happened was there was a mine in the water, but even up till this day, they're not 100% sure what happened. But anyway, the sentiments like go to war with Spain. So he tries to negotiate with Spain and have them give Cuba its independence, and it doesn't work out. So they declare war on Spain, and Spain is probably assuming that, this war is going to be mostly in the Caribbean, but America had other plans, and so they sent Admiral Perry out of Hong Kong with a big American fleet to Manila in the Philippines, and he sunk the whole Spanish fleet there. So that ruined everything they had in the Pacific. They also took Guam, which the Spanish on the island didn't even know the war had begun. So that was pretty easy. And then they ended up taking Puerto Rico and Cuba. But this was interesting because, as I mentioned, the United States didn't want to be the big colonial power. They wanted to be the good guy, right? So they actually had a Teller Amendment before they even went to war, which basically said that regardless of what happens in Cuba, America will give them independence. And it wasn't just because they were being a nice guy. There was also economics involved. And so in Colorado, there was huge sugar plantations, and one of the senators there had basically pushed for this amendment because he didn't want to compete with the Cuban sugarcane. And so Cuba kind of becomes like a protectorate, and they get their independence later. But we did end up leasing Guantanamo Bay, which is why the United States still has that today. And then later, the Philippines got their independence in 1946, and Guam and Puerto Rico are still territories today. So it was a big deal that they occupied the Philippines because they had just said that they didn't like colonialism, and now you began to be a colonial power. So regardless of the situation, not surprisingly, he was super popular going into the next election, which was against William Jennings Bryan. And most of the issues were similar. It was still over like silver and some other things, but McKinley won by even a bigger margin, which isn't surprising because the economy was going well. They had just won this big war. And so his second presidency began. He went on a tour around the states for a few weeks, and then he ended up visiting the PanAmerican Exposition in Buffalo, New York in September of 1901. So the PanAmerican Exposition was basically a way to show all of the splendor and galore of the United States and world, show off the technological and industrial achievements. And they also had a lot of like art and music and Native American things. And so it was a really spectacular thing. Like they spent a lot of time to build all of these structures and have this central theme and all of this stuff. And another amazing thing about this exposition was the first time they had lights, because Buffalo at that time was the first city with lights, because Niagara Falls powered the electricity. And so this was another huge thing at that time. Buffalo was the 8th biggest city at that time and was super important because they had the Erie Canal, which connected the Great Lakes out to the Hudson near New York City, and then that went out to the Atlantic. So really important city at that time. So the guy who assassinated McKinley was Leon Czolgosz. He came from a family of Polish immigrants. He was born in 1873 in Detroit, Michigan, and later moved down to Cleveland, Ohio. So around the time he was 20 years old is when this huge depression hit in 1893. He had been working on a mill and was laid off. Later they reopened, but of course they wanted to pay everyone less wages. There were all these brutal strikes and labor disputes that were super violent and really tough economic times. So it's not a surprise that a lot of people got into things like socialism, communism, and anarchism. So after being disillusioned with all of these violent strikes and craziness around him, he ends up living on his father's farm for a few years and became a recluse in like his mid-20s basically. And then in May of 1901, he went and saw a speech by the Jewish immigrant Emma Goldman, who's a really famous anarchist at that time, and he was really inspired. And he even went to Chicago, like to her house to even meet her. And I guess he was like either pretty awkward or they were worried about him in some ways because they had said to their other members of these anarchist and socialist groups to be on the lookout for this guy because he's asking a lot of names and things like that. So they were even pretty paranoid of him as well. And so he believed, like a lot of socialists or communists, that the rich are exploiting the poor and he needs to do something about this. So he wants to kill McKinley because he's creating all of this great injustice in the world, basically. And so he goes to the Pan Am Exhibition to shoot the president. And he actually first considered doing it right when he got off the train, but there was a bunch of police around. And then on September 5th, McKinley made a big address in front of about 50,000 people, and he was going to do it there, but he didn't have the opportunity. But the next day he had kind of a meet and greet at the Temple of Music. And so it was normal for him to go up and meet people. And his aides and the security in general were very worried because there was just a couple big assassinations in Europe, in Italy and somewhere else. And so they're well aware that there were anarchists and other people assassinating powerful figures like this. And so Leon Czolgosz had a handkerchief around his hand which concealed the gun, and he walked up to the president like he was going to shake his hand, and he shot once. It hit a button and like missed him basically, and then the second shot went directly into his stomach. I think he used like a .22, so not a very large caliber, but at that time it's a big deal because they didn't have antibiotics or anything. And so, of course, the security and people around tackled Leon and beat him up really badly. And McKinley, being the nice guy he was like, don't hit him, don't take it easy on him, guys. And so they take McKinley away. And ironically, Edison even had an X-ray machine on display at the exposition. But unfortunately, I don't think anyone knew how to actually use it. And it was too small to get around the body of the president because he was pretty overweight at that time. So of course they're looking for a good surgeon to be able to help the president. And one of the best doctors in town was Roswell. Today they even have some hospitals named after him. And he was actually in surgery, and he's like, I can't leave this surgery even if it is the president, which is fair enough. It would be totally unethical for him to do that. So they end up having a gynecologist treat him, basically. And so he tried to go in and find the bullet in his body, and it was lodged in his back, and so they couldn't get it out. So they just stitched him up and pretty much sent him on his way. So the first couple days, his body's in shock. It seems like he's in pretty bad shape. And then ironically, he kind of appeared to be better for the next few days because the initial shock was over, but slowly the gangrene and blood poisoning and whatever else was happening inside of his stomach was slowly taking over. And he went pretty fast in the last 24 hours. It was about 7 or 8 days later that he passed away. If he would have had antibiotics, which came about 30, 40 years later, he probably would have been okay. Or if Roswell or other great surgeons had been nearby, he might have been able to be saved, actually. So that was a shame that it was just bad timing there. Emma Goldman did get arrested as well, and they tried to see if there was any conspiracy with her to kill the president. but they couldn't find anything. But she did praise him for what he did. She said something to the extent that Americans celebrate people on Memorial Day or on the 4th of July, and he's also a patriot, basically, or something. So pretty crazy there. What she said was so extreme, even the other anarchists and socialists had to distance themselves from her, because even for them that was pretty extreme. So pretty tragic. He was actually the third president to be assassinated. And so Leon Czolgosz goes to trial, and it didn't take long for him to get the death penalty. And he was electrocuted not too long after that. So I'll head over now to the area where he was assassinated, just a couple blocks north of here. So it was here at the Temple of Music 123 years ago that McKinley was shot here. So as you can see, this is all residential now. The exposition was only temporary. So the structures, as beautiful and as amazing as they were really only temporary. Only a couple months after that, they actually got rid of the buildings in that area. And as you can see, it's all residential now. But here's the area where he was shot. Unfortunately died about a week later. Really sad, such a popular guy, just wanted to be really personable and meet and greet people, and that made him very popular, which I think that's why Trump's doing all these rallies. There's no reason after he was shot at he should do this, but it does gain some popularity to be among the people. So unfortunately there wasn't a Secret Service back then. Really cool buildings down here. It's got like a mixture of like a Native American vibe, a kind of deco style. But on here it has, this memorial's a few different things, but William McKinley is on this side here. William McKinley was elected to Congress as a representative from Ohio in 1876, 78, 80, 82, 84, 86, 88. Was elected governor of Ohio in 1871. And 1893, President of the United States in 1896 and 1900. Can't imagine our forefathers like McKinley and all the people from, 100 or 200 years ago would think today of how this country's going. Man, yeah, it was an amazing city, but deindustrialization ruined it because everyone wanted too much. The workers wanted like 4-day work weeks and retire after 20 years, so it's not a surprise that all that stuff went over to China and Mexico and everywhere else. So what a shame. A lot of amazing buildings in downtown Buffalo and a nice waterfront too. Definitely a nice place to visit. And just a few miles from here, you've got Niagara Falls too, so not a bad stop if you're around this area. So I'll go into some of my final thoughts about this. Obviously super tragic what happened. And as I looked into the story, it's ironic how a lot of these things are happening today. It was just less than a month ago that a young guy had tried to assassinate President Trump. And in some ways, Trump was similar to McKinley. They were both for like tariffs and more isolationism. And of course, Trump's much more obnoxious. McKinley was definitely very well liked. But even though he was well liked, he was still unfortunately assassinated. And it's tragic how all these young people are being influenced by a lot of these ideas which have been proven over and over not to work by the same groups of people. So some things will never change, I guess. And it's unfortunate because I understand this like whole idea of like all the rich people stole all the money, but people give all their money every day to Jeff Bezos and to Walmart and all of these big businesses. And they have to make the cheapest price because that's what everyone wants. If you have two products that are basically the same, you're gonna get the cheaper one, right? And so it's not that they like went out of their way to say, I wanna pay everyone the least amount of possible. It's the customer and the consumer who's like, I'm gonna pay the least, which is why Americans get most of their stuff from Amazon and from Walmart, because 75–80% of that stuff comes from China, which has the lowest price because they have less regulations, they have less taxes, they have cheaper labor, etc. So when we go shopping every day, we do vote several times a day, and it's always going to be the best product for the cheapest price. And so we all want the cheapest prices because we want to maximize our profits. Sound familiar? So does every businessman. So we're actually not that different from any of these supposed like robber barons who stole everything. I mean, you could pay people $100 an hour at an ice cream stand or a burger stand, but the burger or the ice cream is going to be like $75. So they unfortunately have to go about doing that. So it doesn't mean that there shouldn't be like labor disputes or strikes or people shouldn't fight back, but that's just the way the world works, unfortunately. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video. Like and subscribe if you did, and I'll have plenty more cool videos coming for you guys. Talk to you later.